6 years before the disaster, the danger above Pantglas Junior School had already been named in writing, not rumored, not feared in private, written down, sent through official channels, received by the institution that owned the land above the village. 116 children were in that school. The warning existed. The school was still below the tip when it moved. That is the question this episode stays with. Not how the mountain fell, but why a written warning was not enough to stop it. Aberfan was a village in South Wales, built where the valley narrowed and the colliery set the rhythm of daily life. The mountain sat above the houses. The school sat below the mountain. The space between them was small enough that on a clear morning you could see both from the street. The Merthyr Vale colliery had operated for decades. It made work, and work made waste, and the waste had to go somewhere. When the valley floor could no longer hold it, the spoil went upward onto the slope, stacked into tips that grew year by year into permanent features of the landscape. By 1966, there were 7 of them. Together, they held roughly 2.7 million cubic yards of colliery waste. Tip 7 was the highest and the most recent. It sat directly above the houses on Moy Road and above Pantglas Junior School. The village did not own what sat above it. The National Coal Board did. In a mining community, that arrangement was simply the structure of things. Technical authority belonged to the institution, and the institution was supposed to know what it was doing. Parents in Aberfan understood pit risk the way all mining families did, as part of the ground beneath daily life. Something present, something managed by the people whose job it was to manage it. What they were not expected to understand, and had no mechanism to question, was the engineering of what stood above their homes. The colliery and the school were part of the same map. Children walked to Pantglas past the pithead buildings. Fathers worked underground beneath the same mountain the tips crowned. October 21st, 1966 was a Friday, the last day of term before a half-term. The village had its own pace, shift patterns at the pit-shaped mealtimes. The school week ran parallel to the work week. Risk in Aberfan had a familiar face. It came from underground, from the dark and the gas and the machines, and it was managed by men who knew the ground. The tips above the houses were simply there, the way mountains are simply there, ordinary in the way that only long familiarity can make a danger seem ordinary. That assumption had a name. It was called trust, and it was reasonable, and it was wrong. Here is the first thing that made the disaster possible. The law did not require it to be prevented. In 1966, British law had no working safety framework for colliery waste tips. There was no national standard requiring that spoil heaps be designed, drained, inspected, or managed as the civil engineering structures they actually were. Tips fell between legal categories. No single body was clearly and unambiguously responsible for making them safe. Inside the National Coal Board, the position was the same. The NCB had no tip policy forcing safe design and management across its operations. A tip was treated as a consequence of production rather than as an engineered structure with its own behavior and its own failure modes. Engineers at the colliery level made local decisions within a system that gave them no framework and asked them no systematic questions about what was standing above the nearest village. To understand why that institutional gap was lethal, you need to understand what a tip actually is. A heap of dry rubble stays where it is put. A tip of wet colliery spoil does not behave the same way. It is a structure with water inside it, and the water changes everything. It changes friction between particles. It changes the way pressure builds inside the mass. Under certain conditions, it triggers a process called liquefaction, where saturated material stops behaving like a solid and begins to move like a fluid. Friction fails. Gravity takes over. When a tip made of that material sits on a steep slope, over broken ground, over springs and old watercourses, the question is not whether it can fail. The question is what would need to align for it to fail catastrophically. At tip 7, the conditions that needed to align already existed. The warning came from Merthyr's town clerk. The tribunal that examined the disaster later recorded correspondence between the local authority and the National Coal Board beginning in July 1959. The town clerk was writing on behalf of the local authority about the potential danger of the Aberfan tip, formally through official channels, addressed to the institution with legal responsibility for the ground above the village. The board received the letter. A year later, in June 1960, the correspondence sharpened. The tribunal recorded that the town clerk wrote of concern that the central danger that would later define the disaster had already been named. The tip might slide after heavy rainfall. That sentence was the warning. It was local. It was written. It was practical. And it arrived at the board early enough that 6 full years remained in which the danger could have been addressed. A drainage program, an independent structural assessment, a monitoring regime. Any of these could have followed from a system that treated a letter like that as requiring an engineering response. What came back was reassurance. The tribunal and parliamentary record later exposed the nature of that reassurance. It came from an institution that had not built the machinery to know whether reassurance was warranted. There was no independent inspection. There was no drainage audit. The correspondence entered the system, and the system absorbed it without generating a response proportionate to what it described. This is the gap that runs through the whole case. Not ignorance, not deliberate concealment. A system that received a warning and had no internal mechanism to convert that warning into engineering action. The letters were not the only signal. In 1944, one of the tips above Aberfan slipped. A movement was recorded, noted, and filed. The tips continued to grow. In 1963, tip 7 moved. A slide was recorded on the same structure that would fail in 1966. Further movements followed in the years before October of that year. Each of those events was evidence about how this particular tip behaved under pressure. Each went into a record that did not produce a change in how the tip was managed, because there was no system requiring anyone to look at that record and draw conclusions about what it meant for the village below. Consider what the record contained by the mid-1960s. A tip with a documented movement in 1963. A local authority letter from 1960 warning specifically of slide risk after rain. Watercourses and springs in the ground beneath it. Old slip material in the geology it rested against. An institutional framework with no requirement to integrate any of these facts into a formal stability assessment. A structure that has already moved once, on ground that was already unstable, with water sources documented beneath it, is not a neutral engineering subject. It carries the information of its own next failure. The 1963 movement on tip 7 is worth pausing on. This was not a distant tip on the other side of the mountain. This was the same structure, the same ground, the same watercourses beneath it. A movement that year should have reopened the question of whether the tip's position above the village had been properly assessed. A cautious reading of the evidence suggests it did not generate that kind of review. The records contained the information. No one with authority over the tip was required to act on it. By the morning of October 21, 1966, the chain had reached its last link. The autumn of 1966 had been particularly wet. The records support movement and settlement on tip 7 in the hours before the slide reached the village. The tip was already failing before the school opened that morning. There was no alarm. Not simply because an alarm system had not yet been built, though that too is true, but because the written warning of 1960 had never become anything operational. The town clerk's letters had not generated a monitoring system. They had not generated a drainage program. They had not generated an inspection that would have caught what the tip was doing that October. The warning existed in documents. It did not exist in practice. Think about what a monitoring system would have required. Not sophisticated technology, not specialist equipment unavailable in 1960s Britain. A qualified person, aware of the ground conditions, visiting the tip regularly during periods of heavy rainfall. A documented protocol connecting what was observed on the tip to a decision about the institution below it. A clear chain, tip condition to responsible officer to school. A phone call if conditions deteriorated overnight. A procedure written down, known to the people who needed to follow it. None of that existed. Not because it was technically impossible, because the letters of 1959 and 1960 had not generated the engineering infrastructure those letters described the need for. The warning named the danger. The system offered no path from the warning to the response. The dominoes were set. No effective law, no tip policy inside the NCB, a history of prior movement on this specific structure, documented water beneath it, and 6 years of warning absorbed without engineering response. What was needed now was enough rain. There had been enough rain. When the mass moved, it did not behave like rubble. The saturated spoil became fluid. It carried the force of the tip down the slope and into the narrow bottom of the valley. The shape of the ground directed it. It struck houses on the upper part of the village first, then reached Pantglas Junior School. 144 people died. 116 of them were children. The record can tell us what failed above the village. It can tell us what was destroyed. The record should be allowed to fall silent at the school wall. People came to dig. From the colliery, from the village, from surrounding towns and communities across South Wales. The effort was immediate and physical and continued through the day and into the night. The scale of what they found when they reached the school made the work extraordinarily difficult. This episode will not go further into what that work involved. The people who came were not part of the failure. They were its opposite. The failure was built on the mountain over years in offices and filing systems and parliamentary silences. The people who dug were the village responding with what it had to what the institution had made inevitable. Within 72 hours, official statements were already framing the event. 3 days after the disaster in Parliament, the official position was that the remaining tip above Aberfan was generally stable and that an alarm system would give warning in case of major movement. Read it carefully, stable as a present claim about a tip that had just flowed through a school. Alarm system as a future intention, announced after the event it was meant to prevent. 3 days after the slide, the board's wider explanation reached toward the geology. The framing tried to make the conditions sound exceptional. Unusual ground, rare configuration, an outcome that could not reasonably have been foreseen. The geology and rainfall were not enough to make the disaster unforeseeable. But if the framing held, then the gap between the warning and the response was not a systemic failure. It was a reasonable professional judgment made in difficult circumstances. The tribunal would spend 76 days testing that claim. Aberfan's parents and residents were present throughout. They did not retreat and wait for institutions to explain themselves in their own time. The pressure that brought the tribunal into existence, that sustained public scrutiny of the board's position, that forced Parliament to engage with accountability rather than offer condolence and move on, none of it came from institutional initiative. It came from the village. The official file did not belong only to officials. The tribunal heard 136 witnesses and examined 300 exhibits over 76 days. That scale is significant. A 76-day inquiry is not a formality. It is not a political gesture toward grieving families. It is the institutional equivalent of saying, the official account will be tested in detail against the documents that exist and the people who were there. Every technical claim the board made about the tip, the geology, the water, and the management would have to survive cross-examination against the correspondence, the engineering evidence, and the testimony of witnesses who had no institutional interest in protecting the board's story. The tribunal placed blame on the National Coal Board, and it reached the conclusion that separates Aberfan from disasters that get absorbed into the category of misfortune. The tribunal concluded that the disaster could and should have been prevented, not might have been preventable under different conditions, not probably avoidable in retrospect. Could and should applied to what actually existed at the time. The actual tip, the actual law, the actual NCB management structure, the actual warnings in writing. Those three words, could and should, close every available exit. They mean the geology defense fails. They mean the exceptional rainfall defense fails. They mean the argument that no reasonable institution could have foreseen this outcome fails. They locate the failure precisely where the evidence located it, in the distance between a warning received and engineering action not taken, a distance of 6 years, a distance that had a written record at both ends. But even after blame was assigned, Aberfan was asked to pay again. Later scholarship and anniversary reporting record that the disaster fund, the money donated by the public to the families and community in the immediate aftermath, was pressured to contribute to the cost of removing the remaining tips. Donations given to bereaved parents were directed toward clearing the structures that had killed their children. That arrangement was eventually corrected. The repayment came in 1997, with later support from the Welsh government. That repayment is not a footnote. It is part of the account of what Aberfan was asked to absorb, years after the slide, from the same institutional culture that had failed to act on the warning. The board's early defense returned to the geology because it was the most available neutral explanation. Rare conditions, exceptional ground. The record does not hold that frame. Mapped water beneath Tip 7 documented. Prior movement on Tip 7 in 1963 recorded. Prior slip on a neighboring tip in 1944 recorded. Written warning from the local authority in 1960, specifically naming slide risk after rainfall. Received and absorbed without engineering action. No tip stability policy inside the NCB. Confirmed. No effective law requiring independent inspection. Confirmed. A school directly below the structure, visible on any map of the valley. Parliamentary debate preserved in Hansard pressed on the same ground, the inadequate inspection regime, the assurances given 3 days after the disaster, and what accountability meant for an institution that had received a warning in writing and returned reassurance. The geology argument did not survive that scrutiny. Scholarship produced decades later reaches the same conclusion. The conditions were not exceptional, and the failure was institutional. My read of this case is narrow. The tribunal matters not because it assigned blame, but because it refused to let the distance between the warning and the failure collapse into the word accident. It followed responsibility backward through correspondence, through inspection records, through management decisions in the absence of management decisions, until accident no longer did the work the board needed it to do. An accident implies the absence of prior knowledge. The Aberfan record contains prior knowledge. A warning received unacted on for 6 years above a school is not an accident waiting to happen. It is a preventable outcome that was permitted to wait. There is an honest limit to what the record permits. The internal conversations inside the NCB following the 1959 and 1960 letters are not fully open to view. That gap should stay visible. It does not weaken the case. What can be established is enough. The warning entered the board's world, and Tip 7 continued to stand above the school for 6 more years. The distance between the warning of 1960 and the disaster of 1966 is 6 years. 6 years in which Tip 7 continued to grow above the school, the correspondence remained filed rather than acted upon, and the legal framework that should have governed the TIP's management did not exist. The tribunal concluded that this distance was not inevitable. It was a choice the institution failed to make. The Aberfan Memorial Charity maintains the memorial garden and the cemetery memorials and exists for the relief of those who suffered because of the disaster. Not those affected, those who suffered. The language acknowledges that the aftermath did not end when the inquiry closed, or the law was written, or the repayment arrived. In anniversary reporting, survivors have described the way October 21st returns each year. Some speak publicly, some do not. Grief in Aberfan belongs to the people who were there, not to the documentary record. The site of Pantglas Junior School is now the memorial garden. Where the classroom stood, the village kept the ground open.